Hello, and welcome to the CETL's session on the Introduction to Assessment, Types and Vocabulary. This session is predominantly here to lay the groundwork for any additional assessment information going forward. As of recording this in December of 2024, Mount West Community and Technical College is definitely experiencing some changes in assessment processes, and we are heading towards, about 2 years from now or so, our visit from HLC. So in preparation for that, and to make sure that all faculty, either new faculty or folks who have been here a while, are fully prepared for all of these changes and improvements, we want to make sure that everybody's got all of the information they could possibly need, starting with the ground level. So assessment vocabulary, different forms of assessment, student success benchmarks, all of that fun stuff that anybody would need to know about before we can start talking about things like analyzing data or what co-curricular means. Now, this session happened live during the December 2024 Assessment Bootcamp, the first of its kind on Mount West's campus. However, this recorded version, was actually taken the day beforehand. So while you are technically missing out on some of that live discussion that's happening, I'm still going to walk you through what those discussion questions were and how you can approach those independently. Now, I do also want to note that you are more than welcome to reach out to one of the co-chairs of assessment. Those co-chairs of assessment are myself, Morgan Byrne, and then Sarah Dick, our Dean of Academics of our LATS division. So if you are interested in or have questions about assessment, you can contact one of us, or you can talk to your respective faculty mentor, chair, or dean. So during this session, we are going to be discussing the following. We're going to go over our outcomes first. Every session that is offered by our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning does have outcomes. That is so that the session can be assessed. Now, let's say that you're watching this a year from now. Can you still assess this session? Yes, technically. The forum is still open and live, at least as of recording this. We do intend to keep using the same one. We've got a really good system for it. And as long as you note which session you are evaluating, you can still provide feedback on it. However, if you want to provide immediate feedback, if you really want to jump into it with the discussion or with our director of our CETL, which again is me, Morgan Byrne, then you're more than welcome to shoot me an email. My email is byrne@mctc.edu. You can also find that in our faculty and staff directory. So we'll go over our outcomes. We'll talk about assessment vocabulary. By no means can we go over every part of the assessment vocabulary list. There's a lot to get through, but we are going to hit the highlights. We'll talk about types of assessment, both examples and benefits of those different kinds of assessments. And then finally, we'll talk about why we do all of this in the first place. Now, to go ahead and start with our learning outcomes, our outcomes for this session are the following. Number 1, identify key assessment types. Examples given: formative, summative, directive, direct, indirect, and associated assessment measures. Number 2, recognize the importance of assessment in supporting student learning. And number 3, define common terms used in the assessment process. So again, coming in at the foundational level, making sure that we all understand the differences between direct and indirect, what makes a formative or summative assessment, and so on. So we're going to go ahead and start with this key discussion here. So in person, we asked the gathered faculty down in GO7, what is assessment? What does this mean to you? So I would love it if you paused the video to consider this question before moving on. What is assessment to you in the context of student learning? Or even, what is assessment outside of student learning in academia? What does it mean to assess something? And then going from there, how do you maybe take that definition and then apply it to improving student learning? So go ahead and pause the video, consider that question, and then we can move forward. All right, I'm going to assume you paused, so let's go ahead and get into it. Now, all of these definitions are taken directly from our assessment manual's glossary. There is going to be a QR code that takes you directly to that glossary later in this video, but if you want a physical copy, physical copies were handed out in the individual faculty folders during Assessment Bootcamp, and I definitely have copies laying around in my office. So if you ever need anything, come to 317, and I can give you a physical copy as well. So we'll go ahead and start with assessment. So to assess is to evaluate evaluate the extent to which students have achieved a learning outcome. Assessment can refer to any variety of methods used to gauge the extent to which a student has achieved a learning outcome, acquired a skill, or exhibited a behavior. So if you were looking at assessment as what does it mean to assess a situation, right? Maybe outside of academia, maybe just in your everyday life when you're problem solving and you're thinking about how to handle something. It's pretty similar to the ways in which it works in academia, in which we are looking at a set of data or a result of something and then coming to some kind of conclusion based on that information, all about student learning and how to improve student learning. So if we are assessing, we're taking a previous assignment, looking at how students performed, and then considering, okay, what worked, what didn't, and how can I improve going forward? So it really is just an academic form of reviewing data and then problem solving and working to improve. Now, the word measure appears in our assessment glossary twice, as a noun and then as a verb. A noun for a measure is the following. A measure refers to the assignment, task, or activity used to assess student learning. You can also think of a measure as an assignment. So whatever it is you are having students do to then test or demonstrate how they've acquired that skill or that knowledge. And then the verb is used generally. This means something similar to assess, as in how do we measure learning in communications classes. So measure as assignment, and then measure quite literally as measuring success or improvement or skill in a specific category. Next, we've got Bloom's taxonomy. I am sure you have heard about Bloom's taxonomy before. If you have not, though, Bloom's taxonomy was originally published in 1956. I believe I'm correct there. And it is often presented as a triangle in its geometrical shape, and it is a series of action verbs that help to provide categories for types of learning and knowledge for students. So for instance, you've got elements that are like create. Create is towards the very top, so students at a foundational level like English 101 or Communications 103 or whatever that foundation level is probably aren't doing anything in terms of like innovation and creation in that foundational course, right? They're learning, they're understanding, comprehending, they're starting to think critically about things, but they're not necessarily creating or doing anything like that yet. But it does provide different categories in which types of learning and knowledge may be divided. And Bloom's taxonomy also helps educators determine at which level their students should be learning. So again, if we're thinking about things like rigor, if I were teaching something like English 102, would I want all of my outcomes to be foundational? Probably not, because the students have already had English 101. It needs to be a little bit more intense. But if I was teaching 101, yeah, ground level is pretty good. And those action verbs too help to make sure that we are working with things that are actually accessible and they aren't inherently vague. And we'll talk more about what that means later. Next is our learning outcomes, and these are statements that express what students should be able to do as a result of completing a course or degree. Their composition is aided by the use of Bloom's taxonomy. Mount West has course, general education, program, and co-curricular outcomes. Outcomes, very similar to the outcomes associated with this session today, are how we assess these courses. You will see in your syllabi, your syllabus template that you're given for your individual courses, that there's a section to input your outcomes. And they're not outcomes that are written by you. These outcomes were written probably a while ago. They were given to you by your chair or your dean or your fellow faculty mentor. And for example, in English 101, we have interpret a variety of print and digital sources or develop a thesis statement, a list of things, 6 in total for English 101, that students should be able to do by the end of the course. And we utilize those outcomes to assess their success at the end of the course. For that final essay, are they able to provide everything in correct MLA format? Are they able to synthesize sources? Are they able to write a thesis statement? Have they conducted a lot of different kinds of research? We have that measure, right, that assignment, to help measure these learning outcomes. Next is alignment, which also relates to that situation I was talking about a moment ago. Alignment is the logical connection between the course level outcomes, module or unit level outcomes, and the assignments used to measure them. For instance, if the first outcome is to develop a thesis statement, and I am thinking, okay, well, I have an informative essay, that has a thesis statement, right? That is that alignment. If this is the outcome, I can rationally understand the connection between the assignment and the outcome. If I was looking at an outcome like interpret a variety of print and digital resources, and I aligned that with my narrative assignment, that wouldn't work very well, right? They're not doing any actual research because it's a narrative assignment. Some narrative assignments can require some research, but mine don't. They're writing about a memory for an English 101 assignment. So that alignment really wouldn't be tangible because they're not doing any research. So that alignment is really the justification for how that measure is assessing that outcome. Closing the loop is a phrase that refers to the conclusion of an assessment cycle. In order to effectively close an assessment loop, the following must take place. And we're going to go through these 4 steps as opening a loop and then closing it. So think of this as a circle. Number 1, assessing a learning outcome. So that is step 1. We can't even open a loop until we are actually assessing an outcome. Number 2, using the data gathered to determine where improvements are needed. So we looked at an assignment, let's say it's that informative essay, and students are nailing it when it comes to their thesis statements, but they're really not utilizing their supporting evidence in a way that they should be, which means I need to go back in and either create an activity for them, change the way that I am delivering this information, beef up my resources. It really depends on how I want to handle it, but something needs to be done. So I'm going to gather that data and figure out what needs to be changed. And then number 3, I'm going to implement those changes the next time I teach that class. For something like English 101, it's changing all the time because we teach it every single semester. If you are looking at a class that is only taught in the fall, you will think about those changes. You'll start working on it behind the scenes, but you'll implement it the next time you teach it in the next fall semester, if that's the only time that class happens. So we implement those improvements, and then we reassess that same outcome to see if learning has improved. If it has, cool, our circle is complete. If it hasn't, we can't complete our loop because improvement hasn't been documented. And that's a big part that Mount West and most other collegiate institutions tend to struggle with. And you'll hear more about that later when it comes to closing the loop data. In particular, we have a lot of sessions on that during boot camp, but also here on the CETL YouTube channel as well. But that loop cannot formally close until we have documented student success. And then we can move on to something else. Now, there are 2 words that you're going to hear, and often they're used as like interchangeable terms, but they're really not. And those are course and class. A course is a broad term. For example, AH 157 is the med-term course at Mount West. A class, however, is an individual section of that course, so maybe section 101. Learning outcomes, however, for all courses should be standard for all of the sections. So for English 101, and I keep using that because that's just it's one of the classes that I teach a lot, there could be like 12 sections of English 101. They have the same outcomes. Even if some of those sections are being taught by adjuncts, they still have the same outcomes. Are we teaching them differently? Probably, right? Every teacher has a different way in which they approach stuff like this, but the outcomes are still the same. The signature assignments are also likely to be the same. So we want to make sure we're looking at course as a broad term. So course would just be English 101 as a whole, and then class would be those 12 plus individual sections of that course. Next, we have direct and indirect assessment. This we're going to dig further into later as well. A direct assessment those measures allow students to demonstrate what they know and can do with their knowledge, whereas indirect measures are based on perceived student learning. Examples include things like surveys, focus groups, reflections, etc. So if we are comparing something like, let's say, a focus group with an oral presentation. The fundamental difference here is that a focus group or a reflection or something like that, one, it does allow for some additional human error. Unless you're sitting down with a rubric and you have a very strict way in which you're evaluating this focus group or the reflection that a student is writing, you are really open to not providing as concrete and guided feedback as you probably should be. But again, in thinking about indirect assessments, they are about perceived student learning. The student maybe isn't demonstrating their ability to interpret a variety of print and text sources or write a thesis statement in a reflection. They're just talking about what they learned. And a student might say, oh yeah, I've been doing a really great job, and maybe they need additional help. But the converse or the inverse is also true. A student might say, nah, I'm not doing very hot when it comes to this assignment, and they've actually been knocking it out of the park, and maybe they're just a little bit harder on themselves. So because of that subjectivity, it becomes really difficult to actually assess. And in this section too, I do want to note that things like attendance, in that case, aren't even really indirect assessments. They're not really assessments at all, but they do kind of strike that same issue here, where a reflection or a survey or attendance doesn't demonstrate learning. It just demonstrates what they had to say about that learning, or what you perceived from the things that you heard or that you read. And that doesn't mean that you should discount that information, but it's not a direct assessment, and it's not really going to help drive the data that we really want, compared to those direct assessment measures like your oral presentations, your portfolios, your essays, your exams, where in which students are tasked with demonstrating the knowledge that they have accumulated over the course of the semester, and then taking it and applying it to the problems or the situations that you have presented for this final assignment. In that case, they are specifically driven to utilize what they've learned and apply it, as opposed to in a focus group or reflection where they may talk about what they've learned, but they're not demonstrating that they have learned it. Two other kinds of assessment are formative and summative assessment. Formative assessments monitor students' success as they progress throughout the course. So one thing that Mount West faculty hear a lot is assess early and often. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. One, of course, is data, but students are more than data, right? And if you are assessing early and often, a big benefit of this is you can kind of see pretty early on when students are going to start needing some help. If you are assessing a student in weeks 7, 12, and then 16, a student may have started having some trouble in week 3. But if you didn't clock it until week 7, that's a lot to work with when it comes to getting them back on track, which isn't to say that you can't, but if you had been assessing earlier, you could have caught that pretty quickly. So formative assessments really help with that. And to kind of remember the distinction between formative and summative assessment, we want to think of this stage, this formative stage, being where the knowledge is forming. So things are beginning to solidify in their minds, but they're not quite at that application stage yet. Or if they are, it's very foundational. Whereas a summative assessment assesses student success at the end of the course. Usually, this assessment is compared with or against some sort of common standard, like a learning outcome or a student success benchmark. So in this case, summative, we are looking at the sum of learning. We are taking everything that student has learned and then asking them to apply it to a presentation, an exam, an essay, whatever it is the students are doing to make sure they're able to demonstrate that learning. So the learning has formed at that point. Things have solidified in that case, and now they're going to utilize that information against that kind of comparative measure, that learning outcome, that common standard, that student success benchmark, whatever it is that you are utilizing to make sure those students are able to successfully meet that outcome, or at the very least to measure how they meet that outcome. Now, like I mentioned, that's by no means the extent of our glossary. Our glossary is pretty long, so if you want to check that out, you can utilize this QR code to go to the digital copy, but if you want a physical copy, you can always come by my office. I am more than happy to print that out for you, or just give it to you if I have extra copies, and I usually have extra copies of everything. All right, so let's talk about assessments in action. While learning outcomes are consistent across all sections, how you teach and assess those outcomes may vary. So in preparation for the Fall 2024 Course Assessment Report Form, which there is a video for on the CEDL's YouTube channel already, I highly recommend you check that out before you submit your assessment report form. That way you know exactly what you're going to be turning in and you've got an idea of how to do that thing successfully. I do want to go ahead and delve a little bit deeper, however, into some various assessment methods that are going to be associated with that form to make sure that everybody really understands the benefits and the why behind why we do this in the first place. So there are tips occasionally on these slides, the first of which here is when you select your assessment measure, make sure you're working with a direct assessment. We have seen assessment reports before where someone will say, well, students attended, which is awesome, right? I love attendance. We definitely want to make sure that those students are there and they are actively learning, but attendance is not a thing to assess. All that does is assess whether or not they were present, but we all know as humans, right, that you can be physically present and not mentally present. And there are a million different reasons for that, but that is just kind of the tip of the iceberg for why this is not an effective method of assessment. And indirect assessments, like those focus groups, those reflections, etc., while definitely worth your time, and you certainly shouldn't remove them from your courses, are really not the kinds of assessments you want to be focusing on for your course assessment report form. You really want to focus on those direct assessments. So we're going to delve a little deeper into formative and summative assessments, indirect and direct assessments, and then alignment as well. And we're going to start with formative. Remember, formative is we're forming that information, we're forming that knowledge, we're kind of maybe at the beginning or the midway point, maybe right before the final, but we are not at that summative point yet. We are still forming our information. Formative assessments are a crucial component of student success. Mount West faculty have often heard the phrase, assess early and often, and formative assessments help to make that possible. So if we are assessing early and often, if we are making sure that we are checking in with students consistently to figure out, all right, by the end of Unit 1 or by the end of Module 2, students were supposed to have learned X, Y, and Z. And X and Z, they nailed. Y, on the other hand, they're struggling a little bit with, which means I'm going to need to adjust how I'm handling this going forward. And we have that information because of these formative assessments. So they are great. We want to make sure that we are utilizing these consistently. Now, when it comes to examples of formative assessments, those might be discussion boards, in-class discussions, surveys, pop quizzes, workshops, or small individual or group projects. So not these larger assessing lots of outcomes, summative assessment kind of deals, but instead checking in periodically. We're halfway through the module. Let's demonstrate this thing that we learned last week. So think of these as lower stakes assignments. And in thinking about our formative assessments, and again, we can think of formative as being similar to forming knowledge or understanding, we've got some discussion questions here. During the in-person version of this session, we kind of had a back and forth between everybody who was gathered in the room. What I would love for you to do, though, is to answer these questions kind of in your head. But if you do want to have these in person, you're more than welcome to. I'm always happy to talk assessment. But these are some things I want you to consider. Number 1, what types of formative assessments do you use in your courses? Number 2, how effective are they? And then number 3, why might formative assessments not be the most beneficial at providing comprehensive assessment data? So I want you to go ahead, pause the video, and consider those questions, especially in the context of any teaching that you have done before viewing this video. All right, so I'm going to assume that you paused, and of course I can't have a dialogue with you. I am a disembodied voice on YouTube, but in thinking about types of formative assessments, you may use some things that we saw on the previous slide. Those pop quizzes, those in-class discussions, those discussion boards. Discussion boards in particular can often be a little contentious. Some students really like them, some students really don't. Some instructors really like them, and some instructors really don't. I kind of fall in the latter camp. I'm not a huge fan. I didn't like them as a student either, but I am a really big fan of in-person discussion. And really getting my students involved, not just in talking to me, but with talking with each other as well. And those can be really great opportunities to see if maybe they're already on the way to mastering that next step of knowledge that we were going to go over, which is awesome. But it's also ways to see, okay, maybe they are a little bit more confused than I thought they'd be, and I need to backtrack and go over some stuff again. That's totally normal. Each individual section is going to need something different, and formative assessments help us to do that. So when it comes to effectiveness, we're going to see situations like that, right? Things will vary by section, but different instructors are going to have different things that they find to be effective. I'm not a pop quiz person, but I'm sure at least one person on this campus is, and it might be really effective for them. That's awesome. And then considering why formative assessments might not be the most beneficial at providing comprehensive assessment data, we really want to look at that adjective comprehensive. If we are looking at formative assessments, and they're really kind of like beginning stages, one outcome, not 6 outcomes, and how they're working together, is it giving us a part of the picture? Yeah, absolutely. But it's similar to doing a puzzle and having the frame around the puzzle, so you get all those side pieces and you put those together, but that's all you have. We have a framework, which is great, but we don't have the rest of the filling, so we can't see that full picture. It's definitely data. It's definitely usable information, but it's not immediately actionable in the same way that full comprehensive data would be, because we're not looking at how they are demonstrating that knowledge or applying that knowledge in a more consistent, a little bit more rigorous situation. These are beginning steps, not the final step to actually applying it. So is it good information? Yeah, absolutely. absolutely, and you definitely need it. Assessing early and often is incredibly important, but we need more than just information from formative assessments. We need summative assessments, especially for these assessment report forms. Summative assessments inform an instructor about students' abilities to comprehend and utilize the sum of knowledge gained in the course. Examples are definitely not limited to, but might include exams, oral presentations, research essays, portfolios, and a final project of some kind. Anybody working in academia knows that there are tons and tons and tons of ways in which you can assess student learning, especially at the end of the course. But we can already see, comparing these examples to the ones we saw earlier, reflections, those focus groups, things like that, where these are fundamentally different, right? Especially in terms of rigor and application. And in thinking about summative assessments, and again, we're thinking about that as being the sum of learning achieved, we want to consider the following. Number 1, what types of summative assessments do you use in your courses? Number 2, how effective are they? And then number 3, what steps have you taken to improve your summative assessments? Or assessment, if maybe you only have the one. So, like we did earlier, go ahead and pause this video, and then I will continue in a moment. Okay, so if we are talking about types of summative assessments, since again, I am just a disembodied voice and we cannot have a live dialogue right now, I will say that in terms of summative assessments for my class, we do a narrative, we have an annotated bibliography in which students have to conduct research, summarize each source, and then evaluate each source, and then of course, they utilize that research to then write a larger essay. We do similar things in English 102 as well, although I will say that I, as somebody with a creative writing background, do add some additional funky things in there. But those summative assessments, because I am, as an English instructor, in a position to take all of my outcomes and use a larger measure to assess all of them, I try to do that as often as I can. So not only am I assessing the students after they've had weeks and weeks to utilize or learn this information, they are also taking all of those outcomes and utilizing them together. Now, if you are someone who has 100+ outcomes and you are thinking, I can't do that, totally understand, 100%. We are not expecting you to. In your case, it might be 4 or 5 outcomes together. You do not have to assess all of your outcomes in that course at the same time, because some of you just may not be able to do that. That's totally fine. I'm not saying that you have to, but using mine as an example, I am able to take those students and what they've learned and then assess them using a measure that looks at all of those outcomes together. And if we're going back to that puzzle example, right? Thinking about what this is as a puzzle, it's not just the framework anymore. Now it's all those portions that are filled in. And because I'm looking at that full picture, it's going to be a lot easier to see where those gaps are and how I can fill in those gaps and what specific information I'm going to need to fix that puzzle or make sure that it's perfect once I look at those pieces and then reconfigure them to get that final picture. And how effective are they? Again, very similar to our formative assessments. It's going to depend on the instructor. Some folks, for instance, on this campus teach phenomenal ways in which you can present something orally. I am not that person. While I do definitely talk in front of people all the time, I do it in classes and then with faculty and stuff like that. That is not something that I do in my English classes. So while that may be incredibly effective in one class, it's maybe not as effective in mine, and that is okay. Some people do large-scale research projects. Others do more hands-on community service type activities. There are lots of different ways in which you can do this, and the effectiveness is going to rely on individual sections, individual instructors' strengths, and then also, too, thinking about the outcomes. How effective are they in making sure those students are meeting those outcomes? You could have a phenomenal assignment, but it may not be doing exactly what it needs to do. More on that in a moment when we talk about alignment. But when we talk about effectiveness, while we do definitely want to think about student letter grades, we also want to consider how it relates specifically to these outcomes and where your strengths are. But you might have a strength that is maybe not necessarily aligned with what you're doing in that course. Again, speaking as someone with a creative writing background, there are plenty of things I'd love to do that just don't apply to this class. That sure would be effective in terms of my teaching strategy, but really just aren't pertinent right now. So we want to think of effectiveness as having different layers. And then finally, what steps have you taken to improve your summative assessment or assessments? The first of which hopefully is looking at your course evaluations. Course evaluations are a great way to find out what students have had to say directly about your work, about the coursework, about the organization, the materials that are provided, etc. So that's a big part of it. You want to look at student success data. You can run reports in Blackboard. I have surveys that are embedded into my Blackboard courses that are totally optional for students to fill out, and those also help me to improve my summative assessments. So we have information from students, we have data. There are tons of different steps that you can take to improve these assessments, a lot of which starts there at the beginning, figuring out what's working, what's not working, and then hopefully using the time that you have before you start teaching that assignment or that course again to start thinking about those improvements and then implementing them as quickly as you can. Thinking about that closing the loop, right? And what that loop looks like. Assessing, looking at the data, implementing changes based on that data, and then reassessing to see if we have some documented student learning improvement. Now, in terms of direct versus indirect assessment, they are both great, right? Having that kind of indirect assessment does definitely give us some really interesting information from student perspectives, and it allows us to assess early and often. We don't always have to have these specific formative or summative assessments that are incredibly rigid in nature, right? Having that kind of indirect, let's do a reflection, let's do this, can be very effective at the very end of week 4, where you're just kind of wanting to get some information from students on where they are about a month into the course. So we're not saying that one is inherently better than the other in every single circumstance. It's more so that they're situational. Some things work really well and some things don't for specific circumstances, and we want to go through those. So we've got some do's, right? Number 1, assess early and often. Whatever kind of assessment you are utilizing, preferably a variety, right? We want formative and summative. We want indirect and direct, but it needs to be happening consistently. Number 2, consider a variety of indirect and direct assessments to promote critical thinking and skilled application in your courses. Number 3, utilize specific assessment metrics to provide timely, constructive feedback. And number 4, connect these assessments to both learning outcomes and real-world experiences. I always use the example in my classes of when I was a student, I would hate when someone raised their hand and was like, oh my God, what you just talked about reminds me of that one time that me and my dog, blah, blah, blah. Because I wasn't the kind of student that talked a lot, and I didn't like it when other students would do that and kind of hijack the class. But now, as an educator, I actually, I can recognize that that's an incredibly important thing that student is doing, and it should be encouraged, right? They're looking at what they're learning and then connecting that to their real-world lived experience. And we know, based on studies, that when students do that, they're a lot more likely to remember the information. So taking what you're talking about and discussing how it doesn't exist in a vacuum and that it does apply to things that students are going to see in the real world is a way to make sure that what they're learning really takes place in their brain as something that's going to be relevant outside of the classroom. There are, however, some don'ts, right? Don't utilize indirect assessments as a means of providing comprehensive assessment data at the end of the semester. That's not to say that the information's not valid or important in any way, but it's not going to give you that full picture that you would otherwise want. And number 2, rely or do not rely on subjective interpretation as opposed to a set student success benchmark, rubric, or other assessment metrics. So to kind of flesh that out a little bit more, you might be looking at a student who has tried really, really hard. And that does count for something. I'm not trying to say that it doesn't, but if a student has tried and they have just not met the mark, they have not been able to successfully achieve these outcomes, they have, in terms of, numerically on Blackboard, they have failed the course, that's part of the data that needs to be reported. I understand not wanting to give a student a C or a D. I understand wanting to acknowledge that a student tried really hard, but at the end of the day, that kind of subjective reporting, or if we're giving grades based on, I saw someone say or heard someone say once, you can't grade based on vibes. And that's true. You really can't. It doesn't mean that I'm not advocating for helping students. You should be, right? We should be helping students every single step of the way. But saying something like, well, they tried really hard is a subjective interpretation and not something that can really be quantified. And we do need stuff that can be concretely quantified in this specific context. So if we're talking about assessment metrics and saying, well, we don't want this kind of subjective interpretation, we need these more concrete metrics to help drive assessment, we're going to talk about some examples. The first of which is the one that folks are most likely to hear about, and those are rubrics. Rubrics are awesome. Often constructed with 4 to 5 proficiency levels, rubrics provide a breakdown of content areas that will be assessed and how students can successfully meet specific assignment criterion. We are going to look at some examples as well. Benefits to using rubrics include being able to provide timely, constructive, and focused feedback, helping to eliminate subjective interpretation, and generating comprehensive assessment data. So anybody who has used Blackboard, either the Blackboard Original, like Blackboard Learn, and then Blackboard Ultra, both can run reports on rubrics that are embedded into Blackboard. So you can, and we have a recording of this in one of our previous assessment sessions here on the CETL YouTube channel, you can go into Blackboard and create a rubric. And once you have aligned a rubric to an assignment, which you can actually do in the assignment submission portal, in the section above where you input how many points are associated with an assignment, you can hit the Add Rubric button, and from there you just select the one that you created. And that way, whenever you are grading each individual student, you can click through the rubric and you can select, the points that they are receiving at each proficiency level for each content area. And then afterwards, you can run a report on that rubric and how it assessed every student in that section, which is awesome. So we can get really comprehensive data. I'm not saying that you have to use Blackboard for that. Some people would rather do it by hand. I used to be that person, so I understand. But being able to utilize a rubric gives you the opportunity to have more concrete data than not having a rubric would. And in terms of rubric examples, I do want to note that all of the kind of example outline or templates here that are provided are directly from the second edition of Introduction to Rubrics by Danelle D. Stevens and Antonia J. Levi, which we have a copy of for the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. So if you ever want to rent this textbook, you are more than welcome to. It's awesome. So this first one is likely one that you've seen before. We've got exemplary, competent, and developing. So our 3 different stages of competency here, or proficiency, for our individual content areas. So thesis statement, topic sentences and transitions, supporting evidence, and then in-text citations. It is likely that in a rubric that doesn't have to fit perfectly on a slide like this, you can have a little bit more. But you can see what we mean. We've got all of these individual categories, and then you rate the student based upon which proficiency level they are demonstrating in their submission. That's not the only way to create a rubric, though. In this one, we've got a 1 through 5, 5 being the highest, talking about what each, in this case, this portfolio displays. So we would have a brief description for what each level of proficiency is demonstrating, or this one, which I really like and would like to start incorporating into my own course, which is assignment objectives. And we've got what students did on various aspects of the assignment and what I can do as the instructor next time, changes in instruction and this assignment. And we have sections for content, research, historiography, and writing skills. So what students did well on, what aspects, of the assignment, what did they work on, and then what can I do next time, which would be a really cool, interactive rubric to work on with students. And the complete version that is available in the textbook has checked boxes. So students can go through and say, yeah, we did this, this, and this, and of these 5 examples of things that you could do next time, instructor, I want to see you do this and this, which doesn't mean that you have to take all of that information and do all of it, but it is nice to get student feedback in a way like this that is broken down into each individual content area. And in a lot of ways, this is going to give you a little bit more information than a regular course eval would. So all of these, again, are available in our copy of Introduction to Rubrics, the 2nd edition. So I highly recommend you check it out if you are interested. It is not, however, the only assessment metric that we are going to talk about. The rubrics are a great start. I recommend having them when you can, but there are other options. The next of which is student success benchmarks. So a student success benchmark is a goal set by the instructor pertaining to learning achieved. For example, quote, 75% of students will receive at least an 80% on the final, unquote. So if we are looking at students that are completing a large exam at the very end of their time in this course, we would want to make sure that if we are using this as the final, we want to demonstrate student success, we've got a quantifiable idea of what success looks like. In this case, 75% getting at least an 80. That sounds pretty reasonable. But by having that success benchmark, we can better ascertain who wasn't quite hitting the mark and who was. And then based on that information, where the commonalities are for the students that struggled and what we need to do as instructors to make that better. If students are really struggling with questions 16, 20, and 35, and they're all kind of about the same thing, that's something we'd need to focus on. If they're all about 3 different things, we would still need to take some time to focus on them. Student success benchmarks can help define success in assignments not traditionally scored by a rubric and provide a concrete baseline for future improvements. So we as instructors really need to know what success looks like. Rubrics really help with that because you can break everything down by percentage, by point, etc. But if you're not in a situation to assess, especially your summative assessments, with a rubric, having a student success benchmark is great, and you are required to input your student success benchmark in the course assessment report form that you fill out. So it is very important that you note what success looks like, and that success is directly connected to student learning and not attendance, or yes, all of my students turned something in, which again is good, but doesn't yield anything that we can actually use. Now, those aren't the only 2. They are the biggest. I do want to talk about 2 others. At this time, I'm actually not confident that we have a lot of people utilizing these on campus, but I have worked at other institutions where some instructors have, and they've liked them well enough. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about them. The first of which is learning contracts. Created at the outset of the semester, students work collaboratively with the instructor to construct a contract that outlines expected learning and achievements by the end of the semester. Now, I want to note that these do not deviate from course learning outcomes. The outcomes stay the same. But when it comes to setting those success benchmarks, during that first or second class meeting, students get to converse with the instructor about what constitutes success and what the instructor can reasonably expect from that class. Now, does this then put a lot on the students and the instructor up front? Yes, it does. However, and we also want to think too, right? Individual sections are going to potentially want different things. That's true, but it does definitely make sure that students get a voice in talking about their success and what they think is fair or reasonable. So it is definitely an option. And then individualized learning goals. In addition to the standard learning outcomes, have students determine individualized learning goals for each unit or module. Then instructors compare assessment measured data with the individual goals. So you've got, again, those standard student learning outcomes on the syllabus. They are not changing. The students need to meet them. However, maybe you break those down into smaller pieces per module and you create those with the students. And then at the end of the module, you talk about it. Based on this data, X amount of you hit this and X did not. How can we improve this going forward? What do you guys need? And then you have a dialogue with students. I've actually done that before, less with the individualized goal writing portion, but with doing those smaller assignments and then having a dialogue with students and saying, you did really well on X. Here are some things we need to work on. How can I make this better for you? What else do you need to make this thing successful? And in my experience, it's worked pretty well. So you've got lots of different options for handling these assessment metrics, but bottom line, there really does need to be one in some context, whatever it is that you're working with. These assessment metrics exist to help students understand their performance and to drive assessment data. And data is incredibly important. We're going to hear all about how we are a data-driven institution, and a lot of things are data-driven at this point, especially at the tail end of 2024. But having things like, well, they attended or they turned things in really isn't the data that we need. We need something that is driven a little bit stronger by this really comprehensive data based on student learning, and then how that learning can be improved over time. Now, if you have questions, I do want to remind you that you are more than welcome to contact me, Morgan Byrne, or Sarah Dick, the co-chairs of assessment, at least as of recording this. If this video is still up after we are no longer co-chairs, you can talk to the next round of chairs. You're more than welcome to do that, or the director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. I would also really advocate that you talk to your faculty mentor, your chair, or your respective dean, but know that there are a lot of people on campus who would be happy to help you out. I wish I could have a live dialogue with you right now, but unfortunately, I cannot. I do just want to take this moment to really encourage, if you have those questions, to reach out and talk about them with somebody, because there are going to be a lot of assessment champions here on this campus who would be more than happy to answer your questions. Okay, let's talk about some larger picture stuff. Those are going to be alignment, and then kind of why we do any of this in the first place. So it's vital that we carefully align our assessment measures to specific learning outcomes. We talked about this a little bit earlier, right? And how alignment is the logical connection between an assessment measure, or assignment, and a learning outcome. If the learning outcome is there will be a thesis statement, but the assignment is a narrative essay, narratives don't have thesis statements. So that makes things a little difficult, right? That connection's not there. However, if the outcome is interpret a variety of print and electronic sources, and the assignment is an annotated bibliography that requires students to find 3 scholarly and 2 popular sources, cite them, summarize them, and then evaluate them, yeah, that makes sense. So alignment is that logical connection between outcome and assessment measure. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into these, talking first about how Mount West assesses learning outcomes at the following levels: course, gen ed, program, and co-curricular when applicable. So co-curricular outcomes are not going to be assessed in every single course. So you will not be assessing co-curricular all the time. It says when applicable because co-curricular, the committee, and any folks putting on a co-curricular event, they will be assessing those outcomes. It is applicable in those specific situations, but you will not be assessing co-curricular outcomes all the time. That is something you will be doing in a specific context, and be on the lookout for the co-curricular resources that are going to be available on our CETL YouTube channel and our CETL website as well. Now, in our tips section, it does read, consider your general education outcomes. If your class is assessing oral communication, how are students specifically demonstrating that skill? That's that question of alignment, right? If we're looking at your gen ed outcomes that are embedded in this course outside of just your course learning outcomes, and let's say that you are not a gen ed class, but you still have those gen ed outcomes, and let's say one of them is oral communication, maybe the only gen ed outcome is oral communication. How are those students demonstrating oral communication skills in your program course? What is that connection? What assessment measure are you utilizing to demonstrate student success with oral communication? So let's look at this kind of based on some examples here. By the conclusion of this course, the student will be able to, quote, analyze and interpret a variety of print and electronic sources. Everyone is going to be familiar with this outcome in the English classes before the end of this session. And the alignment measure in this case would be students in English 102 compose a research proposal and annotated bibliography, which must contain at least 6 sources, scholarly and popular. They must summarize and assess each source for credibility, authority, organization, and the success of its argument. So yeah, we can definitely create a connection between these. We have the outcome, and we can logically see how analyze and interpret are connected to the assessment and summary that are happening in this specific assignment, especially since they have to gather those resources themselves. When we're talking about alignment, that's what we mean. Or in this case, by the conclusion of this course, the student will be able to, quote, use appropriate evidence and sound reasoning to make a judgment, unquote. For those unfamiliar, this is the verbiage for our critical thinking general education outcome. And for the measure, students in Communication 112 complete the persuasive speech, which tasks them with identifying a broad problem, creating a position in response to that problem, and then utilizing supporting evidence to defend their stance and persuade their audience of their validity. So if we're talking about using evidence and sound reasoning to make a judgment, and this is all about identifying a problem, creating a position in relation to that problem with research, and then utilizing that research to defend the judgment that they are making, yeah, absolutely, that works. We can see that connection there. But when we're talking about alignment, that connection needs to be like an, oh, duh, right? Because we read that alignment measure section and we think, yeah, no, that makes sense, 100%. So if you're thinking about one of your assessment measures and you know you need to be assessing something like critical thinking, oral presentation, or communication, etc., and you are thinking, we touch on it a little bit, but we don't do it too much, we really need that connection to be tangible. Otherwise, we then suffer on, in this case, looking at like a gen ed outcome like critical thinking, we end up suffering on the gen ed level, and Mount West has struggled with that before. So we really want to make sure that our alignments are as concrete as possible. Now, a new phase of assessment efforts at Mount West will pertain to aligning assessment measures with specific outcomes. This will help to improve all levels of assessment, kind of similar to program alignment maps. There is a video about program alignment maps on our CETL YouTube channel. If you are interested, it goes over directions and some examples as well, but the general conceit of a program alignment map is to take a program course, look at the outcomes that are assessed in that course, and then what assignments are utilized to assess those outcomes. So thinking about student learning and talking about how it's documented. That's awesome. We're going to try to do that for every other element of assessment on this campus. So as of recording this, we haven't started this initiative yet, but it is something that we want to do in the future. We want to make sure that we're able to demonstrate this alignment as concretely as possible so that when we provide data, when we use that data to improve student learning, it can consistently be connected to those learning outcomes at the course, the gen ed, the program, the co-curricular levels. Now, why assess at all? Why go through all of this? Assessment is a lot of work, so especially that second question, it's tough to answer, right? Because you are looking at a lot of stuff to do in some cases. Now, I do want to note something that our deans have been saying pretty consistently, especially throughout this semester, is that you are already teaching, you are already assessing, you're doing all of this. It's just the reporting out that the course assessment report form is focused on. It's really gathering data and talking about why that data works. And in order to provide the right data, you need this foundational information. But why go through all of this, right? Because ultimately, education is a very involved job, as many jobs are, right? But it's consistently changing. And thus, we need to be consistently improving and innovating and doing everything we can for our students to make sure that we are improving student learning. And ultimately, I'm going to talk about 3 different reasons why we assess right. The first of which is to improve student learning. That is number 1. We want to make sure that student learning is consistently improving, not just for us on the back end with the data, but to make sure these students are, in the context of Mount West, learning to lead in the workforce and in the community, making sure they have these resources, making sure they get everything that they need to be successful. And the good news is, when it comes to Mount West's assessment efforts, a lot of the student-facing information, like improving student learning, improving our student learning outcomes, we've done a lot of that already. A lot of the student-facing stuff, Mount West is nailing, which is awesome. It's the back end that we, like most other collegiate institutions, are struggling with. So that's a good thing in the case of the students in particular. B is to improve instructional materials and methods. So we, as instructors, want to make sure that we are utilizing this data to make our courses better. Something that worked 5-10 years ago probably doesn't work now, which can be frustrating. Believe me, I get it. At the time of recording this video, I've been teaching full-time. I think this is my 4th year, and there are definitely things that worked 4 years ago, and it's only been 4 years, and they don't work anymore, and I get it. Man, it's tough, but it is still something that we need to work on. We need to improve these instructional materials and methods over time to make sure that students are getting what they need and that the information is as accessible as possible. And then finally, to generate comprehensive data on said improvements. You'll probably note that a lot of the stuff I've talked about so far is about data, but data is C here and not A. And that is because A and B are going to be the ones that touch students the most. C drives what's going on behind the scenes, right? How we get those improvements to students. But we need that comprehensive data on said improvements. That is something that we and other institutions have really struggled with. We want to make sure that if student learning is happening, it is documented. If loops are closing, if learning is being improved, if we are doing really cool stuff at the course level or the program level, we need to make sure that it is documented. We need that data. So we want to make sure that we are doing all of these things as part of our assessment efforts, and that is really why we do it. And ultimately, are there more reasons than just these 3? Yeah, for sure. There are tons. I'm looking on my desk right now at a copy of Assessing Student Learning, A Common Sense Guide, the 3rd edition by Linda Susky, which we have a couple copies of, one of which is in the CETL's library if you're interested. And it goes into in-depth detail about assessment in what I think is a really cool and accessible way. So after reading this, I'm sure you would note there are a lot of other reasons outside of these core 3, but right now, this is really what we're focused on. We want to improve assessment, and this is why. why. Now, I'm going to end this session here. This is our first full session at the Assessment Bootcamp in December of 2024. So other folks attending this in person would be getting the Welcome to Assessment Bootcamp spiel as we get into the other sessions. But for now, I am going to go ahead and conclude. I am going to note, too, that there is that evaluation survey QR code if you do want to take it after this session has happened. Maybe you're looking at this like a semester or a year later. That's okay. We're always happy to get feedback on it. So thank you so much for your time. If you have questions, comments, concerns, please reach out to your faculty mentor, your chair, your dean, or one of us working on the assessment committee. We'd be more than happy to help you out. Thank you so much and have an awesome day.